young mother sold her wedding ring to feed her baby, but what happened next stunned everyone in the pawn shop. No one in the pawn shop noticed her at first. Amelia Hayes clutched her purse so tightly her knuckles turned white. At 29, she had already lived a lifetime of heartbreak. Once, she had a husband, a home, and the promise of forever. But now, with her baby daughter waiting at home, Amelia faced a choice no mother should ever have to make: selling her wedding ring so she can buy her daughter some food. Her voice trembled as she placed it on the counter. I need to sell this," she whispered. The pawnbroker waited in silence before muttering flatly, $50. That's all it's worth. It was an insult, but also enough to keep her child fed. As Amelia slid the ring across the counter, unaware of who was watching from the shadows, her life was about to change forever. This is the story of how a single desperate act became the beginning of something extraordinary. Just before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We love seeing how far these stories reach. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. Now let's jump back in. Enjoy the story. A single gold band was the last thing she had left of him. Amelia Hayes stood before a choice no woman should ever have to make. Selling the symbol of her broken marriage was the only way to buy her daughter's next meal. The bell above the door of Second Chance Pawn had a tired, metallic chime. It was the sound of resignation. It rang once when Amelia entered, a quiet announcement of her surrender. The air inside was heavy with the scent of old wood, dust, and the faint, bitter smell of abandoned hopes. Glass counters displayed a mosaic of forgotten treasures. There were violins that had once played beautiful music, now silent. There were silver lockets that had once held cherished portraits, their secrets now locked away. And there were rings, rows of them, sparkling under the dim lights, each one a silent testament to a promise that life had tragically broken. Amelia clutched the strap of her frayed purse. Her knuckles were pale. At 29, she felt ancient. The vibrant, optimistic woman who had married her high school sweetheart was a distant memory. That woman had a husband, Mark, whose smile could light up a room. That woman had a future that seemed as bright and boundless as a summer sky. This woman, the one standing under the flickering fluorescent lights of a pawn shop, had only a crushing mountain of medical debt and a 1-year-old daughter at home. Little Chloe's trusting face was the only thing that kept Amelia from completely falling apart. Her daughter, Chloe. The name was a soft whisper on her lips. Chloe, with her mother's warm brown eyes and a laugh that could almost make Amelia forget the hollowness in their lives. But Chloe needed things. She needed diapers. She needed food. She needed the special formula for her sensitive stomach. And the last of Amelia's money from her part-time cleaning job was gone, vanished into the black hole of an overdue rent notice. Inside her purse, her fingers found the cool, smooth circle of gold. Mark had placed it on her finger on a sunny afternoon in a small, crowded courthouse. His hands had been steady, his eyes full of promises. For better or for worse, he had vowed. He had meant it then. But for worse had arrived in the form of a medical crisis that had shattered their lives. Chloe had been born with a heart condition that required a series of expensive surgeries. The mounting bills, the sleepless nights, the constant fear, it had all been too much for Mark. He had left, leaving behind a note that spoke of his own weakness, his inability to cope. He had abandoned them. The ring was the last symbol of that broken promise. It was the only thing of value she had left. A man with a weary face and a bored expression looked up from behind the counter. He didn't offer a smile. People who came here weren't looking for comfort. They were looking for a quick, painful transaction to survive another day. "What can I do for you?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly monotone. Amelia's own voice was a knot in her throat. She took a deep, shaky breath and stepped forward. The worn linoleum floor seemed to pull at the soles of her old sneakers. She opened her purse and placed the simple gold band on the scratched glass counter. It looked so small, so insignificant, a tiny circle of light in the dim, sad room. I need to sell this," she whispered. The words felt like a betrayal. They tasted like failure. The man picked it up without a word. He held it between his thumb and forefinger, his expression unchanging. He turned it over, squinting at the small inscription on the inside, "Always and forever," and then placed it on a small digital scale. He punched a few numbers into a calculator. The silence in the room was a heavy blanket, broken only by the low hum of the lights and the frantic, desperate beating of Amelia's heart. "It's 10-karat gold," he said, his voice flat. Not much weight to it. He looked up at her, his gaze impersonal, assessing. He saw the desperation in her eyes. He saw it every day. It was the lifeblood of his business. "I can give you $50 for it." $50. The number was a cold slap in the face. $50 for a lifetime of shattered dreams. $50 for the last remnant of her old life. It was an insult. It was a travesty. But it was also enough. It was enough for the formula. It was enough for bread, milk, and diapers. It was enough to keep Chloe safe and fed for a few more days. Her pride, a fierce and stubborn thing, screamed at her to snatch the ring back, to run out of this place and never look back. But the image of Chloe's face, of her sweet, innocent smile, was stronger. A mother's love was stronger than any pride. "Okay," Amelia whispered, the word a tiny puff of surrendered air. "I'll take it." A few feet away, standing in the shadows near a rack of old leather jackets, Julian Davenport watched the quiet, heartbreaking scene unfold. He was not the kind of man who frequented pawn shops. He was a man whose name was synonymous with success, a man whose real estate developments had reshaped the city's skyline. He was a billionaire, a man who lived in a world of luxury and power, though he wore his wealth with an understated elegance. He was here for a reason that felt utterly trivial now. He was a collector of vintage maps, and a rare, hand-drawn map of the city from the 19th century had supposedly surfaced in this very shop. But the map was forgotten the moment he saw Amelia. He had noticed her when she walked in, a figure of quiet dignity in a place that had none. He saw the tremble in her hands as she placed the ring on the counter. He heard the pawnbroker's cruelly low offer, and he saw the flicker of pain in her eyes, followed by a look of profound, steely resolve. It was the look of a mother protecting her child, a look that transcended poverty and despair. Clinging to his hand was his own daughter, 4-year-old Sophia. She was a bright, inquisitive little girl with her father's thoughtful green eyes and a cascade of dark curls. She was the center of his universe, the light that had guided him through the darkness of the past 2 years. His wife, Isabella, had been taken from them by a sudden illness, leaving a void in their lives that no amount of money could ever fill. Sophia was all he had left of her. She was his reason for breathing. "Daddy," Sophia whispered, tugging on his sleeve. "Why does that lady look so sad?" Julian looked down at his daughter's innocent face. How could he explain this to a child who had never known a moment of hardship? How could he explain a world where a mother had to sell a piece of her heart to feed her baby? He felt a strange, protective ache in his chest. It was more than pity. It was a deep, resonant empathy that stirred something in him, something he thought had been buried with his wife. He saw in Amelia's quiet strength a resilience that reminded him of Isabella. "She's just having a difficult day, my love," he said, his voice low. He watched as the pawnbroker counted out 2 $20 bills and a 10 and pushed them across the counter. He saw Amelia scoop them up, her movements quick, as if she were touching something unclean. She didn't look at the ring again. She couldn't. She turned, her head bowed low, and walked toward the door, a solitary figure carrying an invisible, crushing weight. In that moment, Julian Davenport, a man who moved mountains of money and built empires of steel and glass, made a decision. He was a problem solver. His life was about identifying a challenge and finding the most efficient solution. But this wasn't a business problem. This was human. This was raw. And it demanded more than an efficient solution. It demanded a compassionate one. He couldn't let her just walk away, swallowed by the cold indifference of the city. He couldn't let that small, brave act of sacrifice be the end of her story for the day. He had to do something. Not out of charity, not out of pity, but because in her eyes, he saw a reflection of a humanity that his own world of wealth and power often obscured. He knelt to look Sophia in the eye. "Sweetheart, can you wait here for 1 minute with Mr. Peterson?" he asked, nodding toward the discreet man in a dark suit who stood near the entrance. Mr. Peterson was his driver and security, a constant, reassuring presence in their lives. Sophia nodded, trusting Mr. Peterson implicitly. Julian walked to the counter. The pawnbroker was already dropping Amelia's ring into a small plastic bag, ready to be tossed into a larger box of scrap gold. "Excuse me," Julian said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable air of authority. "The ring you just bought from that young woman. How much for it?" The pawnbroker looked up, surprised. He recognized the look of wealth, even when it was understated. His demeanor shifted instantly. The boredom was replaced by a keen, calculating glint in his eyes. "Well, sir," he began, his voice suddenly smooth as silk. "It's a lovely piece. There's a sentimental value you just can't put a price on." Julian cut him off. He had no time for games. "I'm not buying a story. I'm buying a piece of gold. You gave her $50 for it. I'll give you $250. That's a handsome profit for 2 minutes of work. Take it or leave it." The pawnbroker's eyes widened slightly. He knew better than to argue with a man like this. He quickly took the deal, placing the ring in a small velvet box and sliding it across the counter. Julian paid in cash, then turned and walked out of the shop, the small box feeling both heavy and hopeful in his hand. He saw Amelia a few doors down, heading into a small, neighborhood grocery store. She was moving with a grim sense of purpose, a soldier on a vital mission. He took a moment, leaning against the cool brick of the building, and formulated a plan. He couldn't just hand her the ring. Her pride, which he had seen so clearly in the shop, would never allow it. He couldn't humiliate her by making her feel like a charity case. This had to be handled with care, with respect. He entered the grocery store a minute after her. It was small and a little shabby, the aisles narrow. He found her in the baby section, her face a mask of relief as she placed a large can of the expensive, hypoallergenic formula into her small handbasket. She then picked up a loaf of bread, a carton of eggs, and a small bag of apples. She was counting the cost of each item in her head. He could see the careful calculations in her eyes. Julian went to the front of the store and picked up a shopping cart. He moved through the aisles quickly, with the same efficiency he applied to his business dealings. He filled the cart, not with extravagant things, but with necessities and a few small comforts. He grabbed several more cans of the same formula, boxes of diapers, baby wipes, and jars of baby food. Then he added things for her: a warm rotisserie chicken, a bag of rice, milk, cheese, fresh vegetables, and a carton of orange juice. On a whim, he added a small bouquet of cheerful daisies and a box of chocolate chip cookies. Every family deserved a few small joys. He got in line behind her. The cashier, a young man with a friendly smile, was ringing up Amelia's meager items. "That'll be $42.50, the cashier said. Amelia carefully counted out 2 of her $20 bills and a handful of change. She paid, leaving her with just a few dollars to her name. She took her single, thin plastic bag and turned to leave, her shoulders slumped with the effort of it all. This was his moment. As she passed him, Julian stepped forward slightly. "Excuse me," he said, his voice gentle. Amelia stopped, turning to look at him. Her eyes, a beautiful shade of brown, were clouded with exhaustion. She didn't recognize him. She saw only a tall, well-dressed man with a cart overflowing with groceries. "I'm in a bit of a predicament," Julian said, trying to sound slightly flustered, an expression that was entirely foreign to him. "My company was doing a charity drive for a local women's shelter, and I was in charge of the shopping. It turns out there was a mix-up with the delivery times, and they can't accept the donation until next week. Now I'm stuck with all of this." He gestured to his overflowing cart. "I can't possibly take it all home, and it seems a terrible waste for it to spoil. I noticed you have a little one." He nodded toward the can of formula in her bag. "I know this is a strange request, but would you do me a huge favor and take some of this off my hands? Especially the perishable items. I would hate to see them thrown away." Amelia stared at him, her expression a mixture of confusion and suspicion. Kindness from strangers was not a part of her world. Her life had taught her that nothing was free. People always wanted something. "Oh, no, I couldn't," she said, shaking her head. "That's very generous of you, but I can't accept that." "Please," Julian insisted, his voice earnest. He looked her directly in the eye, trying to convey sincerity, not pity. "You would honestly be helping me out of a bind. Think of it as a logistical problem you're helping me solve." He gave her a small, self-deprecating smile. "My assistant usually handles these things, and I've clearly made a mess of it." She hesitated. Her gaze flickered from his kind, steady eyes to the cart full of food. The rotisserie chicken smelled warm and delicious. The fresh milk and eggs were luxuries she hadn't been able to afford in months. The extra cans of formula represented a security she couldn't even imagine. Weeks of not having to worry about Chloe's next meal. Her practical, maternal side was at war with her proud, weary spirit. In the end, as it always did, the mother in her won. For Chloe, she could swallow her pride. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice quiet. "I'm positive," Julian said, his relief genuine. "Let me just pay for this, and I can even give you a ride home. It looks like it's about to get dark, and that bag looks heavy." Amelia was completely overwhelmed. This was too much. A ride from a stranger in a car that was likely more expensive than anything she had ever touched? It felt dangerous. It felt foolish. "The bus stop is just around the corner," she protested weakly. "I'll be fine." "I insist," Julian said again, his tone leaving no room for argument. Yet it was not demanding, only firm and reassuring. "My daughter is waiting in the car with my driver just outside. You'd be perfectly safe. Please, let me do this one small thing. The world feels a little kinder when we help each other out, don't you think?" That last sentence disarmed her completely. It was a simple, hopeful sentiment, the kind of thing her grandfather used to say. Feeling as if she were moving through a dream, she finally gave a small, hesitant nod. "Okay," she said softly. "Thank you." After Julian paid for the mountain of groceries, he helped her carry the numerous bags outside. A sleek, black luxury sedan was waiting at the curb. Mr. Peterson, the driver, saw them approaching and immediately got out to open the trunk and the back door. Sophia was in her car seat, her face pressed against the window. The interior of the car was like another world. It was silent and calm, and it smelled of clean leather. It was a world away from the rattling, crowded city bus she usually took. Julian introduced her to Sophia, who gave Amelia a shy, sweet smile. "This is Ms. Hayes, sweetheart," Julian said as he buckled himself in. "We're going to give her a lift home." The ride to Amelia's apartment building was quiet, but not uncomfortable. She gave him the address, feeling a familiar sting of shame as she pictured the cracked pavement and peeling paint of her building. It was in a part of town that men like him usually only saw from a distance. But Julian simply relayed the address to his driver and then turned his attention to Sophia, asking her about her day at preschool. He had a natural, gentle way with his daughter, and watching them, Amelia felt a pang of sadness for Chloe, who would never know her own father's love. When they arrived, Julian insisted on helping her carry all the bags up to her second-floor apartment. "You've done far too much already," Amelia said, her voice filled with a gratitude so deep it was almost painful. "I can manage from here, really." "I'm sure you can," he said with a warm smile. "But my mother taught me to never let a lady carry her own groceries. And I'm already parked." His quiet, good-natured persistence was impossible to refuse. He followed her up the narrow, dimly lit stairs. The hallway smelled of old carpets and cleaning supplies. When she unlocked the door to her apartment, a happy little gurgle came from inside. From a playpen set up in the small, tidy living room, Chloe pushed herself up, her face breaking into a radiant, gummy smile at the sight of her mother. "Mama," she babbled, bouncing on her little legs. In an instant, all the shame and exhaustion of the day vanished. Amelia's world shrank to the size of that smile. She crossed the room and scooped her daughter into a fierce, loving hug, burying her face in Chloe's soft, baby-fine hair. This was why she endured it all. This was all that mattered. She turned back to find Julian standing just inside the doorway, a thoughtful, unreadable expression on his face as he placed the last of the grocery bags on her small kitchen counter. "This is Chloe," Amelia said, her voice soft with love. Julian smiled, and this time it was a full, genuine smile that reached his eyes and transformed his handsome face. "She's beautiful," he said. His gaze took in the small apartment. It was cramped, the furniture old and mismatched, but it was impeccably clean and filled with a warmth that had nothing to do with money. Framed photos sat on a small bookshelf. Amelia and Mark on their wedding day, looking so young and happy. A picture of Amelia as a child with a kind-faced, elderly man in a military uniform, and several baby pictures of Chloe. Next to the photos was a stack of children's books from the library. Julian saw a home that was threadbare in possessions, but rich in love. And standing there, in the doorway of a stranger's humble life, he felt a sense of realness, of human connection, that had been missing from his own for a very long time. He reached into his pocket. "I believe you left this behind as well," he said softly. He held out the small velvet box. Amelia stared at it, her eyes widening in disbelief. Her hand flew to her mouth. She was utterly speechless. The man who bought it, he seemed to have second thoughts. Julian said, offering her a simple, face-saving lie. He sold it to me. I thought you might want it back. Tears welled in Amelia's eyes as she slowly reached out and took the box. She opened it. There, nestled in the dark velvet, was her wedding ring. The symbol of her broken past, her shattered promise. It wasn't just a piece of scrap gold. It was a reminder of a life that was gone forever. And yet, seeing it again, returned to her by a miracle in a well-tailored suit, felt like a small piece of her fractured self had been restored. I don't know what to say, she stammered, the tears now streaming down her cheeks. How can I ever repay you? There's nothing to repay, Julian said, his voice gentle. But I would like to ask you something. The man in the uniform, in the old photograph. Who is he? Amelia wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, still clutching the ring. That's my great-grandfather, she said. Sergeant James Hayes. He was a war hero. The name hit Julian like a physical blow. Sergeant James Hayes. He felt a sudden chill, a sense of destiny so profound it almost took his breath away. He knew that name. He had grown up with that name. It was a name spoken with reverence in his family, a name synonymous with courage and sacrifice. My grandfather, Julian said, his voice barely a whisper, was Private Thomas Davenport. He served under a Sergeant Hayes. A silent, electric understanding passed between them. It was a moment that stretched across generations, a connection forged in the mud and fire of a long-forgotten battlefield. This was no longer just a chance encounter. This was something else entirely. It was history. It was legacy. It was a debt of honor, coming due in the most unexpected way imaginable. And as his car pulled away from the curb a few minutes later, Julian Davenport knew that this was not the end of a simple act of kindness. It was the beginning of something that would change both of their lives forever. The drive back to his stately home in the city's most exclusive suburb was a quiet one. Sophia had fallen asleep in her car's seat, her small face peaceful in the soft glow of the passing streetlights. Julian stared out the window, but he didn't see the familiar, manicured lawns or the grand, imposing houses. He saw a small, clean apartment, a brave young mother, and a baby's radiant smile. He saw a black-and-white photograph of a soldier, a man whose legacy of courage had just reached across more than 70 years to touch his own life in the most unexpected way. Sergeant James Hayes. The name echoed in his memory, a piece of family folklore he hadn't thought about in years. His grandfather, Thomas Davenport, had been a quiet man. Like many of his generation who had seen the horrors of war, he rarely spoke of his experiences. But when he did, it was almost always in fragments, brief, vivid flashes of memory. And the name of his sergeant, a man he called the finest man I ever knew, was always spoken with a tone of reverence that bordered on awe. There was one story in particular that his grandfather had told him, just once, on a quiet evening shortly before he passed away. They had been looking through an old photo album, and a picture of a young Thomas in his crisp army uniform had triggered the memory. His grandfather's voice had been low and thick with emotion, his gaze distant, as if he were looking back through time. He had spoken of a brutal, chaotic battle, of the deafening roar of artillery, the bitter smell of gunpowder, and the chilling nearness of death. His platoon had been pinned down, caught in a vicious crossfire. Men were falling all around them. Thomas, then just a boy of 19, had been hit. A piece of shrapnel had torn through his leg, and he had fallen in the open, unable to move, the world dissolving into a haze of pain and fear. He had been certain he was going to die. But then, through the smoke and the chaos, a figure had emerged. It was Sergeant Hayes. He had crawled out under a hail of bullets, with no regard for his own safety. He had reached Thomas, applied a crude but effective tourniquet to his bleeding leg, and then, with a strength that seemed almost superhuman, had dragged him back to the relative safety of their foxhole. He had saved Thomas's life. It was as simple and as profound as that. He never left a man behind, his grandfather had whispered, his old, wrinkled hand resting on the photograph. Not ever. I owe him everything. My life. Your father. You. That debt, Julian now understood, had just been passed down to him. It was not a financial debt, but something far deeper. A debt of honor. The universe, in its strange and mysterious way, had just presented him with the bill, and the currency required was kindness. The next morning, Julian set his formidable resources into motion. He made a call to a man named Richard Sterling, a private investigator he sometimes used for discreet corporate due diligence. Richard was the best in the business, thorough, silent, and impeccably professional. But this time, the assignment was personal. "Richard," Julian said, his voice low and serious, "I need you to find out everything you can about a woman named Amelia Hayes. And I need you to do it with the utmost discretion. I don't want her to have any idea that she is being looked into. This is a delicate matter, not a hostile inquiry." He gave Richard the address and the few details he had. He also asked him to look into Sergeant James Hayes and his service record to confirm the story his grandfather had told him. Within 24 hours, Richard's report was on Julian's desk. It was a slim folder, but its contents told a story of quiet tragedy and immense strength. Amelia Hayes, married to Mark Peterson, who had left her 6 months prior. The report detailed the extent of Chloe's medical condition and the staggering bills that had accumulated. It confirmed that Mark, overwhelmed by the financial and emotional strain, had simply disappeared, leaving Amelia to face the crisis alone. He had emptied their joint bank account and vanished without a trace. The report also detailed Amelia's struggles, her quiet desperation, and her fierce, unwavering devotion to her daughter. She worked 2 part-time jobs, cleaning offices at night and waiting tables at a small diner on weekends. But her meager earnings barely covered their rent and basic necessities. It was all there, in stark, black and white text. The report also confirmed his grandfather's story. It included a copy of the official citation for the Medal of Honor awarded posthumously to Sergeant James Hayes. He had been killed in action just 2 weeks after saving Thomas Davenport's life, while attempting to rescue another wounded soldier. He was a hero by every definition of the word. He had left behind a young wife and a son, Amelia's grandfather. Julian closed the folder, a heavy feeling settling in his chest. This was so much more than he had imagined. Amelia wasn't just struggling. She was drowning. And she was the direct descendant of the man to whom the Davenport family owed its very existence. He felt a profound sense of shame that his own life was one of such ease and privilege, while hers was a daily battle for survival. He had to do more. The groceries and the ring were a temporary fix, a bandage on a gaping wound. What she needed was a lifeline. What she needed was a future. But how to offer it? He couldn't just write her a check. He knew, instinctively, that her pride and dignity were as fierce as her love for her daughter. A handout, no matter how well-intentioned, would feel like a humiliation. It would rob her of her agency, of the strength that he had admired so much in the pawn shop. No, the solution had to be a job. It had to be an opportunity. It had to be a hand up, not a handout. He spent the rest of the day thinking, pacing the floor of his vast, silent office overlooking the city. He considered and discarded a dozen different ideas. A job in his company seemed too obvious, too corporate. It wouldn't be a natural fit. The answer, when it came, was simple and elegant. It was rooted in the one thing that connected them both on a deeply personal level: family. Julian's late wife, Isabella, had been a passionate advocate for children's health care. Her dream had been to establish a foundation that would provide financial assistance to families struggling with pediatric medical expenses. They had started the process together, but after her death, Julian had been too consumed by his own grief to see it through. He had set aside a substantial endowment, but the Isabella Davenport Foundation existed only on paper. Now he saw a path forward. He could bring Isabella's dream to life, and he could offer Amelia a job running it. It was perfect. Her personal experience, her quiet, steely competence, and her innate compassion made her the ideal candidate. The job would offer her a good salary, stability, and a sense of purpose. It would allow her to use her own painful experiences to help others in similar situations. It would be a role she could not only fill, but excel at. It would be a position of dignity and importance. The next day, he put on a suit, but it felt wrong, too formal, too intimidating. He took it off and put on a simple pair of trousers and a soft cashmere sweater. He wanted to approach her as a person, not as a billionaire. He drove himself, leaving Mr. Peterson and the imposing black sedan at home. He took his own, more modest car, a dark gray Audi that didn't scream wealth quite so loudly. He found Amelia at a small playground near her apartment building. It was a bright, chilly autumn afternoon. Chloe was in a baby swing, her little legs kicking with delight as Amelia gently pushed her. Amelia's face was turned up toward her daughter, and she was laughing, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy that made Julian's heart ache. For a moment, she looked like the young, carefree woman she should have been, the woman who had not yet been touched by grief and hardship. He waited at a respectful distance, not wanting to intrude on the precious, happy moment. When Chloe's laughter subsided into a contented gurgle, he approached slowly. "Miss Hayes," he said, his voice soft. "Amelia?" She turned, startled. Her smile faded, replaced by a look of confusion as she recognized him. "Mr. Davenport," she said, her voice wary. She instinctively moved to place herself slightly in front of the swing, a subtle, protective gesture. "I'm sorry to disturb you," he said. "I was hoping I might be able to speak with you for a few minutes." "If this is about the groceries," she began, her tone formal, "I can't thank you enough, but you really didn't have to." "It's not about the groceries," he said gently. "It's about something else entirely. It's about a job." Amelia's confusion deepened into suspicion. "A job? I don't understand." "I have 2 jobs." "I know," he said, "but I have a proposition for you, and I hope you'll just hear me out." He told her about the Isabella Davenport Foundation. He spoke of his late wife, of her passion for helping families with sick children. He explained that he was finally ready to launch the foundation and that he was looking for the right person to serve as its first executive director. He told her about the responsibilities: managing outreach, vetting applications for assistance, organizing support programs. And then he offered her the position. He named a salary that was more than 5 times what she was currently making from her 2 jobs combined. He mentioned the comprehensive health insurance, the flexible hours, the childcare stipend. He laid it all out, his voice calm and reasonable, trying to present it as a straightforward business proposition. But as he spoke, he could see the walls going up in her eyes. She was pulling away, her expression hardening. It was too much, too fast. It was too good to be true. "Why me?" she asked when he was finished, her voice flat. "I don't have any experience running a foundation. I don't have a college degree. I'm a waitress and a cleaner. Why would you offer a job like this to a complete stranger you met in a grocery store?" It was the question he had been expecting, the question he had been dreading. He had hoped to avoid revealing the deeper connection, at least for now. He had wanted her to accept the job on its own merits, to feel that she had earned it. But he saw now that it was impossible. Her skepticism was a shield, protecting her from a world that had given her every reason to be distrustful. He had to tell her the truth. "Because you're not a stranger, Amelia," he said softly. "And I'm not just a man you met in a grocery store. Our families are connected. My grandfather was Private Thomas Davenport. Your great-grandfather, Sergeant James Hayes, saved his life." He told her the story, the one his grandfather had told him so many years ago. He spoke of the battle, of his grandfather's injury, of Sergeant Hayes's incredible bravery. He explained that the Davenport family owed a debt of honor to the Hayes family, a debt that had been passed down through the generations. "This isn't charity, Amelia," he said, his voice filled with a sincerity that was impossible to doubt. "This is an opportunity. You are the most qualified person I can imagine for this job. You understand the struggles of these families because you've lived them. You have the compassion, the strength, and the integrity to lead this foundation. My wife's dream deserves a leader with heart, not just a resume. And your great-grandfather's legacy deserves to be honored. This job, it's a way to do both." Amelia listened, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock, disbelief, and a dawning sense of wonder. The story of her great-grandfather was a piece of family history she had always cherished, a tale of a hero she had never known. To hear it retold now, by this man, in this context, it felt like a scene from a movie. It felt impossible. But as she looked into Julian's earnest green eyes, she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that he was telling the truth. Tears welled in her eyes, but for the first time in a very long time, they were not tears of sadness or despair. They were tears of hope. A tiny, fragile seed of hope, planted in the barren soil of her life, was beginning to sprout. I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Say you'll think about it," Julian said gently. He handed her a business card. "This is my personal number. Call me when you've had a chance to consider it. No pressure. The offer will stand." He gave her a small, hopeful smile, then turned and walked away, leaving Amelia standing by the swing set. The future of her and her daughter suddenly, miraculously, rewritten. Amelia spent the next 2 days in a state of suspended disbelief. She went through the motions of her life, changing diapers, preparing meals, scrubbing floors, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying Julian Davenport's incredible offer. It felt like a dream, a beautiful fantasy that would vanish the moment she tried to grasp it. Her life was defined by struggle. Miracles, she had long ago concluded, were for other people. Every instinct honed by years of hardship screamed at her to be wary. Men like Julian, who lived in a world she could only glimpse in magazines, didn't just appear on playgrounds and solve all your problems. There had to be a catch. On the third day, as she was scrubbing a coffee stain from a boardroom carpet, the exhaustion hit her. Her back ached, her hands were raw. She looked at her reflection in the polished table and saw a woman being worn down to nothing. She thought of Chloe, sleeping soundly at the babysitter's. What kind of future was this for her daughter? A future where her mother was always tired, always one unexpected expense away from disaster. Chloe deserved better. Her great-grandfather had been a hero, facing down bullets to save another man. He had acted with courage. And what was she facing? Not bullets, but bills. The fear of accepting Julian's offer was a fear of the unknown. But the fear of not accepting it was far worse. It was the fear of a future that was an endless repetition of the present. Courage wasn't just for soldiers. Sometimes, courage was simply saying yes to hope. She pulled Julian's card from her pocket, her hand trembling as she dialed. "Davenport. Mr. Davenport," she said, her voice a whisper. "It's Amelia Hayes." There was a slight pause. "Amelia," he said, his voice instantly warmer. "I'm glad you called. I've thought about your offer," she said, taking a deep breath. "And I accept." A week later, Amelia walked into the gleaming lobby of the Davenport Tower. It was a world of polished marble and quiet power. She wore the best dress she owned, a simple black one from a thrift store, and felt like a sparrow that had flown into a palace of eagles. Julian had arranged a temporary office for the foundation on the 20th floor with a breathtaking view of the city. For the first time, looking down, the world seemed full of possibility. Julian was there to greet her, patient and methodical. He introduced her to an administrative assistant, a kind, middle-aged woman named Carol who immediately put Amelia at ease. "The first thing I want you to do," Julian said, handing her a thick file, "is to forget you're working for me. You are the director. This is your vision. This file contains our preliminary research. Read it, and then I want you to create a mission statement. In your own words, what do you want the Isabella Davenport Foundation to be?" For the first few days, Amelia felt a paralyzing inadequacy. She was surrounded by people with advanced degrees, speaking a language of budgets and strategic planning that was entirely foreign to her. She felt like an imposter. But then, she would think of Chloe, of the desperation in the pawn shop. Julian hadn't hired her for her business acumen. He had hired her for her heart. She pushed aside the dense reports. She closed her eyes and thought about the families in the hospital waiting rooms, of the single mothers taking 3 buses to get to appointments, of the fathers working double shifts to pay for medication. She thought of her own journey. And then, she began to write. She used simple, direct words. She wrote about hope and dignity. She wrote that the foundation's purpose was to be a source of light in a family's darkest hour. When she showed her draft to Julian, he read it in silence. Amelia's heart pounded. He looked up, a look of profound respect in his eyes. "This is perfect," he said quietly. "This is exactly what Isabella would have wanted." In that moment, Amelia's self-doubt began to recede. She allowed herself to believe she could do this. The weeks turned into months. Amelia threw herself into her work with a passion that impressed everyone. She was a quick learner, meeting with hospital social workers and doctors, building a network of partners. She spent her evenings teaching herself about nonprofit management. She designed the foundation's first program, the Angel Fund. It wasn't just about paying medical bills. It was about providing practical, immediate support. It offered families gas cards for appointments, grocery vouchers, and funds to cover lost wages. It was a program born from her own lived experience. Julian remained a constant, supportive presence, but he was careful to let her lead. They fell into a comfortable routine, meeting twice a week. Their conversations, which began with budgets, often drifted into more personal territory. He would ask about Chloe, who was thriving. Amelia would ask about Sophia. They discovered a quiet, easy camaraderie. Amelia found that beneath Julian's polished exterior was a man of deep kindness and gentle humor. Julian, in turn, was continually struck by Amelia's resilience and compassion. He started to look forward to their meetings, to the quiet moments of connection that were a balm to his solitary life. One December afternoon, Amelia was working late, preparing for the Foundation's official launch event. The office was quiet. There was a soft knock on her door. It was Julian, holding 2 cups of coffee. "I saw your light on," he said with a smile. "Thought you might need some fuel." "Thank you," she said gratefully. "I was just going over the first grant recipients." "Ready for the launch tomorrow night?" he asked. The event was a formal gala. Amelia was scheduled to give a speech. "I'm terrified," she admitted. "You'll be wonderful," he said confidently. "Just speak from the heart. Tell them your story. Tell them these stories." He gestured to the files on her desk. He sat in the chair opposite her, and they sipped their coffee in comfortable silence. "I was thinking today," Julian said, his gaze distant, "about our grandfathers. I wonder what they would think." "I think they'd be proud," Amelia said softly. "My great-grandfather believed in helping people, that we're all in this together." "My grandfather never really recovered from the war," Julian said. "But the one thing that gave him peace was knowing there were men like Sergeant Hayes, men who ran toward the danger." He looked at Amelia. "You have that same courage." Amelia blushed. "I'm not a hero, Julian." "Aren't you?" he asked gently. "You faced your own battlefield, and you didn't just survive it. You're using it to change the world. If that's not heroic, I don't know what is." His words, and the sincere admiration in his eyes, touched her deeply. It was a moment of pure, unguarded connection. The space between them, once a vast chasm, had been bridged by a shared legacy of honor and a mutual respect that was beginning to feel like something more. They were partners, and they were just getting started. The launch was a major event. The hotel ballroom was filled with a glittering crowd of the city's wealthiest people. Amelia, standing backstage in an elegant dress Julian's assistant had helped her pick out, felt a fresh wave of panic. Julian found her there, a reassuring presence. "They're waiting for a hero," he said softly. He spoke first, briefly and eloquently about his late wife. Then, he introduced Amelia, calling her the heart and soul of this foundation. Amelia walked to the podium, her carefully prepared notes vanishing from her mind. Then she saw a face in the crowd, a hospital social worker she had befriended, who gave her an encouraging nod. It was enough. Amelia took a deep breath and pushed the note cards aside. She spoke from the heart. She spoke of what it felt like to be the parent of a sick child, the fear, the loneliness, the impossible choices. Her voice, at first trembling, grew stronger. The room was utterly silent. She told them about the Angel Fund, sharing the anonymous stories of the first families they were helping. She gave a human face to the statistics. "My great-grandfather was a soldier," she concluded, her voice thick with emotion. "He believed that you never leave a comrade behind on the battlefield. The families we serve, they are in a battle for their children's lives. They are our comrades. We cannot leave them behind." She stepped back from the podium to a moment of stunned silence, followed by a thunderous, sustained standing ovation. It was genuine and heartfelt. In that moment, Amelia wasn't a former cleaner. She was a leader. The rest of the evening was a blur of congratulations and pledges of support. Late in the evening, Julian found her by the windows overlooking the city. "I believe the word is triumphant," he said, a proud smile on his face. "I can't believe it," she said with an overwhelmed laugh. "You should," he said. "You moved them. You gave the foundation a real, human heart." A waiter came by with champagne. Julian took 2 glasses and handed one to her. "To Sergeant James Hayes," he said softly, "and to his great-granddaughter." "To Isabella," Amelia replied, meeting his gaze. "And to a debt of honor, finally being paid." They touched their glasses together, a quiet, perfect chime. It was a moment of shared victory, of profound, unspoken connection. But as they stood there, celebrating the bright new future they were building, a ghost from Amelia's past was about to walk back into her life, threatening to destroy everything. His name was Mark Peterson, and he appeared 2 days after the gala, a specter at the feast. Amelia was leaving the Davenport Tower, heading home after a long but exhilarating day, when she saw him. He was leaning against the stone planter across the street, watching her. For a moment, her mind refused to process what her eyes were seeing. He looked different, thinner, his face etched with a kind of cheap, weary dissipation she didn't recognize. But it was him, the man she had once promised her life to, the man who had abandoned her and their daughter without a backward glance. A cold, paralyzing dread washed over her, so intense it was hard to breathe. He saw that she had spotted him, and a smug, unpleasant smile touched his lips. He pushed himself off the planter and started to cross the street, weaving through the rush-hour traffic with a reckless sense of entitlement. Amelia's first instinct was to run, to turn and flee back into the safety of the gleaming tower behind her. But she was no longer the same woman who had crumpled in the face of his desertion. She was the director of a foundation. She was a mother who had fought for her child's survival. She would not run. She stood her ground on the wide, granite plaza, her purse clutched in her hand like a shield. "Hello, Amelia," he said, his voice a gravelly imitation of the one that had once whispered words of love to her. "You look prosperous." His eyes raked over her, taking in her tailored coat, the quality of her leather bag. It wasn't a compliment. It was an appraisal. "What do you want, Mark?" she asked, her own voice colder and steadier than she felt. "What do I want?" He gave a short, bitter laugh. "That's a good question. A man comes home to find his wife has taken his child, moved on up to a penthouse suite with some billionaire. I think the question is, what am I owed?" "You don't have a wife," Amelia said, her voice sharp. "You walked out on her. You walked out on your sick daughter. You have nothing." "Oh, I don't know about that," he said, stepping closer. She could smell stale cigarette smoke and cheap whiskey on his breath. "I saw you on the news. Amelia Hayes, director of the Isabella Davenport Foundation. Very impressive. You and your rich boyfriend, doing so much good for all the poor, unfortunate souls out there. It's a real touching story." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But I know another story. A story about a loving husband, driven to despair by his wife's ambition. A man who had to leave to find himself, only to come back and find his family stolen from him by a rich predator." The blood drained from Amelia's face. She understood now. This wasn't about reconciliation. This wasn't even about Chloe. This was blackmail. "That's not what happened," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Doesn't matter what happened," he hissed. "It only matters what people will believe. A scandal like that, it could be very bad for your little foundation. Your rich donors, they don't like messy stories. They like saints. And you, my dear Amelia, are no saint. Now, $100,000 seems like a fair price for my silence. A small price to pay to keep your new, perfect little world from falling apart." He smiled again, that same ugly, triumphant smile. "You have 24 hours to get the money. I'll be in touch." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the anonymous evening crowd, leaving Amelia standing alone on the plaza, her world tilting on its axis. She somehow made it home, moving like an automaton. The fear she had fought so hard to overcome had returned, a cold, venomous thing coiling in her stomach. He was right. The story he could tell, full of half-truths and vicious lies, would be a disaster. It would tarnish the foundation, Isabella's memory, and Julian's good name. The donors would scatter. Everything she had built would crumble into dust. All her hard work, all her hope, would be for nothing. Her first, panicked instinct was to protect the foundation at all costs. She would get him the money. She didn't have it, not that much, but she had a salary now. She could get a loan. She would pay him. She would make him go away. The thought of telling Julian was unbearable. How could she admit that her sordid, messy past had come back to threaten his immaculate world? It was her problem, her shame. She would handle it herself. But as she sat in her quiet apartment that night, watching Chloe sleep peacefully in her crib, a different feeling began to take root. It was a slow-burning anger. She had survived his abandonment. She had pulled herself up from the depths of despair. She had found a strength she never knew she possessed. Was she really going to let that man, that coward, reduce her to a frightened victim all over again? Was she going to let him hold her future hostage? The next day at the office, she was a wreck. She couldn't focus. Every time the phone rang, she jumped. Carol, her assistant, asked her if she was feeling all right. Amelia mumbled something about a headache. She tried to work, but Mark's smug, threatening face kept swimming before her eyes. Julian had a meeting with her that afternoon. The moment he walked into her office, he knew something was terribly wrong. The light he had seen ignited in her over the past few months was gone. The old, haunted look of fear was back in her eyes. "Amelia," he said, closing the door behind him, his voice gentle. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," she said too quickly. "I'm fine. Just a long night." He didn't believe her. He sat down in the chair opposite her desk, his gaze steady and patient. "We're partners in this," he said quietly. "And we're friends. Whatever it is, you can tell me. Let me help." His kindness was her undoing. The dam of her fear and her shame finally broke. The whole sordid story came pouring out, punctuated by quiet, ragged sobs. She told him about Mark's appearance, his threats, his demand for money. When she was finished, she couldn't bring herself to look at him. She stared at her hands, twisted together on her desk, fully expecting to hear disappointment or even anger in his voice. She waited for him to tell her that this was too much, that she was a liability he could no longer afford. Instead, there was a long silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was not angry. It was perfectly calm and as cold and hard as steel. "You will not pay him a single dime," he said. Amelia looked up, confused. "But the foundation, the press." "The foundation will be fine," Julian said, his expression resolute. "Amelia, did you really think I wouldn't be prepared for this? Did you think I would leave you and this foundation vulnerable?" He stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the city below. "When I first asked my investigator to look into your situation, his report was comprehensive. It included everything. Mark's gambling debts, the fact that he emptied your joint bank account before he disappeared, his current whereabouts. I've had him monitored since the day I offered you this job. I was hoping he would be smart enough to stay away. But I knew that a man like that, a man driven by weakness and greed, would likely see your success not as something to be proud of, but as something to be exploited. I was prepared for him." Amelia stared at him, utterly stunned. He had known. He had been protecting her, silently, from the very beginning. "My security team," Julian continued, his voice still unervingly calm, "has already compiled a file on Mr. Peterson. A very thick file. It includes bank records, sworn statements from people he has borrowed money from, even security footage of him at off-track betting parlors. We know where he is living. We know who he owes money to. We know everything." He turned from the window to face her. "He thinks he has power over you. He is mistaken. We have power over him. Now, here is what is going to happen. You are going to call him. You will agree to meet him. You will tell him you have the money. And then, you are going to let me handle it." The meeting was set for that evening at a quiet, anonymous coffee shop downtown. Amelia felt a tremor of fear as she walked in, but it was different now. It was overshadowed by a sense of resolve. She was not walking in alone. Mark was already there, sitting in a booth in the back, nursing a cup of coffee. He looked impatient. "You got it?" he asked as she slid into the seat opposite him. "It's not that simple," Amelia said, her voice steady. Mark's face darkened. "Don't play games with me, Amelia." "She's not playing games." The voice came from behind Mark. He turned, startled, to see Julian Davenport sliding into the booth beside him. He was flanked by another man in a dark suit, Mr. Peterson, the driver, though his expression was now anything but friendly. Mark was effectively boxed in. "Who the hell are you?" Mark blustered, though a new, uncertain fear was dawning in his eyes. "I'm the man whose foundation you're attempting to blackmail," Julian said, his voice low and even. He placed a thick manila folder on the table and pushed it toward Mark. "And this is the end of that conversation." Mark opened the folder. His face went pale as he flipped through the pages. He saw bank statements. He saw copies of bounced checks. He saw photographs of himself he didn't know existed. He saw a detailed, irrefutable timeline of his own pathetic, irresponsible life since the day he had abandoned his family. "You have two choices," Julian said, his voice cutting through the silence of the coffee shop. "Choice one, you walk out of this coffee shop, you disappear from Amelia's life and from this city, and you never, ever contact her or your daughter again. In return for your permanent absence, these documents remain private, and the police are not notified of the felony theft you committed when you drained your joint bank account. Choice two, you refuse. In which case, this folder goes directly to the district attorney and to every major news outlet in this city. You will be prosecuted. You will be publicly humiliated. Your creditors will descend upon you like wolves. I will personally see to it that your life becomes exceedingly difficult. The choice is yours. You have 10 seconds. Mark stared at Julian, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. He saw no room for negotiation in the billionaire's cold, determined eyes. He saw only the swift and total annihilation of his own life. He was a bully and a coward, and faced with a power far greater than his own, he did what cowards always do. He folded. Without a word, he closed the folder, shoved it back across the table, and scrambled out of the booth. He didn't look at Amelia. He couldn't. He walked quickly out of the coffee shop and disappeared into the night, a ghost finally, and permanently, vanished. Amelia sat in the sudden silence, a profound, shuddering wave of relief washing over her. It was over. The last chain tying her to her painful past had been broken. She was truly free. She looked at Julian, her eyes shining with unshed tears of gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. It was all she could manage, but the words were filled with a universe of meaning. He simply gave her a small, reassuring nod. "No one will ever threaten you or Chloe again," he said. And it wasn't just a promise. It was a statement of fact. In the weeks that followed, the last of the shadows lifted from Amelia's life. The fear was gone, replaced by a deep and abiding sense of security and peace. The work at the foundation thrived, becoming a beacon of hope for hundreds of families across the city. Amelia's leadership, once born of necessity, was now fueled by a confident, quiet passion. Her friendship with Julian deepened, settling into a comfortable, unspoken partnership. They were a team, in the office and, increasingly, outside of it. They would take their daughters to the park on weekends, a small, unconventional family of 4. They watched as Sophia, with her bright, inquisitive nature, took on the role of protective older sister to Chloe, who was now a happy, toddling 1-year-old. One bright spring afternoon, they were sitting on a park bench, watching the girls play together under a blossoming cherry tree. "You know," Amelia said, her voice thoughtful, "when I walked into that pawn shop, I felt like my life was over. I was selling the last piece of a story that had ended in failure." "That wasn't the end of the story," Julian said, his eyes on the laughing children. "It was the beginning of a new one." He turned to look at her, and in his gaze, she saw not just respect and friendship, but a deep, quiet affection that mirrored her own. There was no need for grand declarations. There was no need to define what was growing between them. It was simply there, a strong and steady presence, a love built not on grand passion, but on a shared history of honor, a foundation of mutual respect, and a quiet, everyday miracle of 2 broken families becoming whole again. The journey had started with the sale of a simple gold band, a symbol of a past she had to let go of in order to survive. But it had led her here, to a place of unexpected grace, to a future brighter than she had ever dared to imagine. It was a testament to the enduring power of kindness, the unbreakable bonds of legacy, and the simple truth that sometimes, a debt of honor can be repaid with the most precious currency of all, a second chance at happiness. And that's where we'll end the story for now. Whenever I share one of these, I hope it gives you a chance to step out of the everyday and just drift for a bit. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down. Drop a line in the comments. I really do read them all. And if you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. We are always trying to improve our stories, so feel free to also drop your feedback in the comment section below. Thanks for spending this time with me.